The most dangerous mistakes are not the ones we make with our hands. They are the ones we make with our assumptions. I remembered those words far too late, because on a quiet Thursday night, I became completely convinced that my new neighbor was hiding something terrible. It all started just after 11 o'clock when I stepped onto my apartment balcony, carrying a mug of coffee I absolutely did not need. Sleep had refused to cooperate, and the cool Seattle air seemed like a better solution than staring at my bedroom ceiling. The neighborhood was unusually quiet. Most windows were already dark, the sidewalks were empty, and the only sounds came from distant traffic and the soft rain that had started falling an hour earlier. That was when movement across the courtyard caught my attention. My neighbor, Liam Carter, quietly walked out of his apartment carrying a plain cardboard box. We had lived across from each other for almost 6 months. We always exchanged polite greetings, occasionally complained about the unreliable elevator, and once spent 20 minutes laughing because both of us accidentally wore the same navy blue rain jacket to the apartment barbecue. He always seemed friendly, calm, and impossible to dislike. Yet that night something felt completely different. Liam looked around the parking lot before walking toward a black sedan that had just pulled into the far corner beneath a broken streetlight. The driver never stepped out. Instead, Liam approached the passenger side window, carefully handed over the cardboard box, accepted a thick envelope in return, and quietly nodded before walking away without another word. Every crime movie I had ever watched suddenly volunteered its opinion. That cannot be good, I muttered to myself. I knew I should have gone back inside and minded my own business, but curiosity has always been my least attractive personality trait. I remained perfectly still on the balcony while the sedan slowly disappeared into the rainy night. Liam stood there for another moment before checking his phone. Although I could not hear everything, the cool evening air carried enough of the conversation toward me to make my imagination work. Over time, yes, he said quietly. Everything went exactly as planned. He listened for a moment before adding, nobody can know. It has to stay between us. My heart immediately began inventing explanations that were probably far more dramatic than reality deserved. Liam slipped his phone into his pocket and disappeared back inside his apartment as though nothing unusual had happened. I remained on the balcony several minutes longer, staring at the empty parking space where the sedan had been. The next morning I convinced myself I had probably misunderstood everything. People exchanged packages all the time. Envelopes could contain documents instead of money. There had to be a perfectly ordinary explanation. Then I opened my apartment door to leave for work and almost walked directly into Liam. Morning, he said with his usual relaxed smile while holding a paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. Looks like the rain finally gave us a break. I forced a smile that felt much less convincing than his. Looks that way. He held up the paper bag. They accidentally gave me an extra cinnamon roll. Want it? Under normal circumstances, I would never refuse free pastry. That morning I hesitated for a second too long before politely declining. A faint look of confusion crossed Liam's face, but he simply smiled again. Maybe next time. We walked toward the elevator together in complete silence, and for the first time since moving into the building, I found myself secretly watching every small thing he did. The calm smile, the easy conversation, the completely ordinary behavior. None of it matched the mysterious meeting I had witnessed only hours earlier. Yet one question refused to leave my mind. If Liam had nothing to hide, then why had he been so careful to make sure nobody was watching the night before? The next morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. I had seen one late-night meeting, one cardboard box, and one mysterious envelope. That was hardly enough evidence to accuse someone of anything. Even so, every time I looked across the hallway and saw Liam leaving his apartment with his usual calm smile, the conversation from the night before echoed in my mind. Nobody can know. It has to stay between us. Those words refused to leave me alone. I spent most of Friday trying to focus on work from my apartment, but concentration lasted about 10 minutes before my eyes drifted toward the living room window overlooking the shared courtyard. Around noon, I watched Liam help Mrs. Henderson from the third floor carry several heavy grocery bags into the building. She smiled warmly before patting his shoulder, and he laughed at something she said. It was difficult to connect the thoughtful neighbor helping an 80-year-old woman with the mysterious man secretly exchanging packages after dark. Maybe he is just very convincing, I muttered to myself. My own imagination was becoming exhausting. Later that afternoon, I walked downstairs to collect a package from the lobby, only to find Liam kneeling beside a little girl whose bicycle chain had slipped off. Grease covered his hands as he patiently explained how the gears worked while the child's father watched with obvious gratitude. 10 minutes later, the little girl happily rode circles around the parking lot as though nothing had happened. Liam wiped his hands with a paper towel and smiled when he noticed me standing nearby. "Looks like we saved another bicycle," he joked. "You repair bicycles too?" I asked before I could stop myself. "Only the ones that threaten to ruin someone's afternoon." He shrugged casually. "My grandfather taught me years ago." I nodded politely, but inside my mind refused to slow down. Why would someone who seemed genuinely kind also be meeting strangers in dark parking lots? That evening, the apartment community held its monthly outdoor cookout beneath the covered picnic area. Neighbors laughed, children played tag between picnic tables, and someone insisted on bringing portable speakers that played old classic rock songs almost nobody admitted enjoying. Liam stood near the grill talking comfortably with several residents while occasionally helping refill drinks or carry folding chairs. He looked exactly like the type of neighbor every apartment building hoped to have. More than once I caught myself wondering whether I had completely imagined the suspicious meeting. Then, just as I started believing I had overreacted, Liam quietly stepped away from the gathering after glancing at his phone. He walked toward the edge of the parking lot where the security lights grew noticeably dimmer. Instinct told me not to follow him. Curiosity ignored that advice immediately. I stayed far enough away to avoid being noticed while watching him stop beside another unfamiliar vehicle. This time the driver remained inside with the window lowered only a few inches. Liam handed over another small package before accepting what looked like another sealed envelope. My pulse quickened. There it was again. Exactly the same pattern. Before leaving, the driver quietly said something I could not hear. Liam answered softly, "Please remember what we agreed. Nobody else needs to know." The sedan pulled away without turning on its headlights until it reached the street. I remained hidden behind a large maple tree, completely convinced I had just witnessed something no ordinary neighbor should ever be involved in. Yet the strangest part happened only seconds later. As Liam turned back toward the apartment building, he noticed an elderly resident struggling to carry a walker up the front steps because the accessibility ramp was temporarily closed for repairs. Without hesitation, he hurried over, smiled warmly, and helped the man reach the entrance before wishing him a pleasant evening. I stood there completely confused. Every suspicious moment was somehow followed by an act of genuine kindness, and the two versions of Liam Carter refused to fit together inside my mind. Saturday morning should have been enough to convince me I had completely misunderstood everything. The apartment courtyard was full of ordinary weekend life. Children rode bicycles between flower beds, neighbors walked their dogs, and someone on the second floor was once again attempting to learn the guitar with a level of confidence that greatly exceeded his talent. Liam stood beside the community garden, helping Mrs. Henderson replace several broken tomato stakes, while patiently listening to her stories about growing up in Oregon. Nothing about him looked suspicious. He smiled easily, laughed often, and somehow managed to remember the names of almost everyone in the building. I watched from my balcony for several minutes before shaking my head. "You are officially becoming paranoid," I told myself. Then my phone buzzed with a notification from the building's community message board. Someone had posted a reminder about next weekend's neighborhood charity fundraiser. As I scrolled through the comments, I noticed Liam had volunteered to organize donations again, just as he had the previous year. That made even less sense. Why would someone secretly involved in something illegal spend so much time helping everyone else? The question followed me all afternoon. Around 3 o'clock, I headed downstairs to check my mailbox. As I reached the lobby, I noticed Liam standing near the entrance speaking quietly with a man I had never seen before. The stranger wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face and carried a plain manila envelope. The moment he noticed me walking closer, the conversation stopped. Liam smiled naturally. "Hey, Evan." "Hey." I glanced toward the stranger, who gave a polite nod before quietly handing Liam the envelope. "Everything okay?" I asked casually. "Just taking care of something," Liam answered with the same calm smile he always wore. The stranger quickly walked outside without another word. I tried convincing myself it was probably nothing. Then Liam slipped the envelope into his backpack before immediately changing the subject. "How is your project at work going?" His timing felt almost too perfect. That evening, I found myself watching from my living room window again, something I never imagined I would become the type of person to do. Around 8 o'clock, Liam left the building carrying the same backpack. Instead of walking toward the parking lot this time, he headed several blocks away to an older neighborhood where small single-family homes lined quiet streets. Curiosity won another argument against common sense, and I followed from a distance. Liam stopped in front of a modest white house with peeling paint and a neatly trimmed front yard. He looked around briefly before placing a sealed envelope inside the mailbox. He did not ring the doorbell. He did not wait for anyone to answer. He simply turned and began walking away. Before he reached the sidewalk, the front door quietly opened. An elderly woman stepped outside, looked inside the mailbox, and immediately covered her mouth with both hands. Even from across the street, I could see tears filling her eyes. She looked around, searching for whoever had left the envelope, but Liam had already disappeared around the corner. I stood frozen behind a parked truck, completely confused. That did not look like anything criminal. It looked like someone receiving help they never expected. Yet before I could fully process what I had just witnessed, my phone vibrated. Looking down, I noticed an accidental photo notification from the camera app that had somehow activated while I hurried after Liam. The image was blurry, but one detail stood out clearly. The envelope sticking out of Liam's backpack earlier that afternoon had a small blue logo in the corner. It was the logo of the Seattle Community Assistance Foundation. Every theory I had built over the last 3 days suddenly developed its first serious crack, and for the first time I wondered whether the biggest mistake in this entire story might not belong to my neighbor at all. Sunday morning arrived with one question refusing to leave my mind. Had I spent the last several days accusing the wrong person inside my own head? I tried convincing myself to forget everything and move on with my life. But the image of the elderly woman opening that envelope remained impossible to ignore. There had been no fear on her face, no panic, only relief so overwhelming that she had covered her mouth before quietly crying on her front porch. That was not the reaction of someone involved in anything illegal. It was the reaction of someone receiving unexpected kindness. Even so, too many pieces still refused to fit together. The late-night meetings, the secretive conversations, the envelopes, the insistence that nobody could know. I needed answers, and for the first time I realized those answers might begin with a conversation instead of another assumption. Around noon, I walked downstairs, intending to clear my head with a short walk. As soon as I stepped into the lobby, I nearly collided with Liam carrying 2 paper grocery bags. One apple rolled across the floor before stopping beside my shoe. "Well," Liam laughed, "that is one dramatic entrance." I picked up the apple and handed it back to him. "Sorry about that." "No damage done." He balanced both bags against one hip before smiling. "Actually, would you mind helping me carry these upstairs? I may have overestimated how many groceries one person should buy." 5 minutes earlier, I had been convinced I needed to confront him. Instead, I found myself carrying bags full of vegetables, soup, fresh bread, and bottled water into his apartment. The place looked exactly like I expected. Neat bookshelves, framed family photographs, a guitar resting near the window, and absolutely nothing that suggested secret criminal activity. "Thanks," Liam said as he placed the groceries on the kitchen counter. "I owe you one." I looked around before quietly asking, "Do you always buy this much food?" He hesitated for the first time since we met. "Not always." Before he could say anything else, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and the relaxed smile on his face immediately softened into quiet concern. "Excuse me for just a second." He stepped into the hallway outside the kitchen, believing I could no longer hear him. His voice remained low, but a few words still reached me. "I understand. Yes, I can bring everything this afternoon. Please tell her not to worry." He paused while listening. "No, she cannot know where it came from." My heart tightened again. The old suspicion tried one last time to return, but it no longer felt as convincing as before. When Liam returned, he found me standing beside the kitchen counter with an expression I could no longer hide. He looked at me for several seconds before quietly asking, "Evan, is there something you want to ask me?" I took a slow breath. There was no point pretending anymore. "I saw you that night in the parking lot." His smile disappeared. "I also saw you delivering envelopes yesterday." The room became completely silent. Liam lowered his eyes for a moment before looking back at me with calm resignation rather than fear. I was hoping nobody in the building noticed. I noticed everything. He nodded slowly. Apparently, neither of us spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Liam leaned against the kitchen counter and quietly sighed. I cannot tell you every detail because it is not only my secret. He looked directly into my eyes. But I can tell you one thing. I waited without saying a word. Liam's voice became almost a whisper. The worst thing I have done this week is let someone believe I was the wrong kind of person, because keeping one promise mattered more than protecting my own reputation. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Liam's words echoed through the quiet apartment while I stood there feeling every assumption I had made over the last 4 days slowly falling apart. I had watched him from my balcony, followed him through the neighborhood, and quietly built an entire story about who I believed he was without asking him a single honest question. Now, standing in his kitchen surrounded by grocery bags and ordinary furniture, I suddenly realized how unfair that story had been. I looked down before quietly saying, "I owe you an apology." Liam smiled sadly and gently shook his head. "Not yet." I looked back up. "What do you mean?" He rested both hands on the kitchen counter and took a slow breath. "If I tell you everything now, it stops being only my secret." I nodded. "Then tell me whatever you are allowed to tell me." He remained silent for a moment before speaking. "About a year ago, I met an elderly man at the community center. He had recently lost his wife and was quietly trying to support his daughter and granddaughter after they lost their home. They refused to ask anyone for help because they were too proud. I listened without interrupting. Several neighbors started helping anonymously. Some donated groceries. Others paid utility bills or left gift cards inside mailboxes. He smiled faintly. Eventually, I became the person who delivered everything because nobody recognized me outside our neighborhood. Suddenly, every late-night meeting began fitting together. "The envelopes?" I asked. Liam nodded. "Mostly grocery gift cards, rent assistance, or donations collected from people who wanted to remain anonymous. The cardboard boxes? Food, medicine, school supplies, and sometimes winter clothes." I remembered the elderly woman crying on her porch. Liam looked toward the window before continuing. "She promised she would stop accepting help if she ever discovered who was providing it. She believed charity meant she had failed." He smiled gently. "So we promised nobody would ever know." My chest tightened with guilt. "That was why you kept saying everything had to stay secret." "Yes. And the people meeting you in the parking lot." Liam laughed softly for the first time since our conversation began. "Mostly volunteers finishing late work shifts. Nighttime was the only time everyone could meet." I closed my eyes briefly, embarrassed by how completely wrong I had been. "I thought," Liam smiled kindly. "I know what you thought. I convinced myself you were doing something illegal. I guessed that might happen eventually." I stared at him in disbelief. "You guessed?" He nodded. "People usually become suspicious when they only see half of a story." I laughed quietly at myself. Apparently, I became extremely suspicious. "You are not the first." We both smiled, and the tension that had followed us for days quietly began disappearing. I looked around the apartment again, this time noticing details I had completely ignored before. Thank you cards tucked neatly into a bookshelf. A volunteer badge hanging beside the front door. A calendar filled with handwritten reminders for food deliveries and community events. The evidence had always been there. I had simply been looking for the wrong things. "Why did you never tell anyone?" I asked. Liam shrugged gently. "Because helping someone should never become a performance." He smiled with quiet sincerity. "If people feel grateful to the person instead of hopeful about tomorrow, then the kindness starts becoming about the wrong thing." I looked at him for several seconds, unable to think of anything clever to say. Finally, I laughed softly. "You know something?" "What?" "You are somehow the exact opposite of the person I spent 4 days believing you were." Liam smiled warmly. "That is probably the nicest apology anyone has ever given me." I laughed again, but behind the laughter another realization quietly appeared. For the first time since moving into the building, I was no longer looking at my mysterious neighbor through the lens of suspicion. I was finally seeing the extraordinary man who had been living just across the hallway all along. Monday morning felt strangely different, not because the apartment building had changed, but because I had. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, I walked across the hallway without carrying suspicion in the back of my mind. Instead, I knocked on Liam's door holding 2 paper coffee cups and a small white bakery bag. A few seconds later, he opened the door wearing a faded gray sweatshirt, looking slightly surprised. "Good morning," he said with an amused smile. "Should I be worried?" I handed him one of the coffee cups. "Only if you dislike free coffee." He accepted it with a quiet laugh. "That would be a terrible personality flaw." I held up the bakery bag. "I also brought cinnamon rolls because apparently declining one last week has been bothering me more than I expected." Liam smiled warmly. "That is a surprisingly specific apology. I have been trying to improve." He stepped aside, inviting me into the apartment again. This time the room felt completely different. The volunteer calendars, thank you cards, and neatly organized donation lists no longer looked like random details. They looked like pieces of a person I had finally taken the time to understand. We spent breakfast talking about ordinary things instead of mysterious ones. Liam told me funny stories about helping children repair bicycles during community events, and I admitted I once tried to assemble a coffee table upside down because I believed instruction manuals were only suggestions. "Did it work?" he asked. "Only if gravity suddenly changes its mind." He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. The easy conversation surprised both of us. It felt as though the awkwardness from the previous week had quietly disappeared. The moment honesty entered the room. Later that afternoon, Liam asked whether I wanted to help deliver groceries to a retired couple recovering from medical treatment. Only if I promised not to accuse anyone of secret crimes along the way, I joked. He looked at me with playful seriousness. That would definitely improve the volunteer experience. We loaded several grocery bags into his car before driving across town together. Along the way, I noticed something I had completely missed before. Liam greeted every volunteer by name. Every family smiled when they saw him. Nobody treated him like someone seeking recognition. They simply trusted him. Watching him speak with an elderly couple on their front porch while quietly making sure they had enough food for the week changed something inside me. There was no performance, no expectation of praise. Just genuine kindness offered as naturally as breathing. On the drive home, I looked out the passenger window before quietly saying, "I spent 4 days believing I understood exactly who you were." Liam kept his eyes on the road. "And I was completely wrong." He smiled gently. "You are here now. That is what matters." I laughed softly. "You forgive people much faster than I deserve." "Maybe." He glanced toward me for a brief second before returning his attention to the road. "Or maybe I have wanted an excuse to spend more time with my neighbor for longer than you realize." I turned toward him, surprised. "What?" A faint blush appeared across his face, and he laughed quietly at himself. "Forget I said anything." "Absolutely not." He smiled without answering. The silence that followed felt completely different from the uncomfortable silence we had shared only days earlier. This one felt hopeful. As we pulled into the apartment parking lot, I realized I was no longer wondering whether Liam was hiding a dangerous secret. Instead, I found myself wondering how I had managed to live across the hallway from someone this remarkable for 6 months without truly seeing him. And somewhere between delivering groceries, sharing coffee, and laughing over my own terrible assumptions, I began to suspect the greatest surprise waiting for me had never been the truth behind Liam's secret. It was the quiet realization that I had started looking forward to every moment I could spend beside him. The rest of the week passed with a kind of quiet excitement I had never expected to feel every time I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Somehow the same neighbor I had spent days secretly investigating had become the person I looked forward to seeing most. We shared morning coffee before work, helped organize food donations after dinner, and somehow managed to laugh through every ordinary conversation as though we had known each other far longer than 6 months. One Thursday evening, we finished delivering groceries to a family across town and stopped by a small neighborhood diner on the drive home. The waitress smiled the moment we sat down. "You two together?" she asked while handing us menus. Before either of us answered, she placed one menu back under her arm. "Actually, never mind. Couples always share fries anyway." Carter nearly choked on his water while I laughed so hard I had to wipe tears from my eyes. "We are just neighbors," I managed to explain. The waitress smiled knowingly. That is usually how it starts. After she walked away, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Liam laughed quietly. "Well, that was unexpectedly specific. She seems very confident." Suspiciously confident. We both smiled, but this time the silence that followed felt different. It lingered just long enough for both of us to realize the joke had unsettled us because it had quietly touched something neither of us had admitted yet. After dinner, we walked back through a nearby park instead of heading straight home. The evening air was cool, and the walking paths glowed beneath rows of small park lights while families packed up picnics and children chased one another across the grass. We stopped beside a small pond where ducks drifted lazily across the water. Liam leaned against the wooden railing before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." He looked toward the water instead of at me. "When you first moved into the building, did you really dislike me?" I smiled awkwardly. "I thought you were secretly running some kind of criminal organization." He laughed softly. "Fair point. Then I thought you were hiding something dangerous." "Also fair. Now I mostly think I owe you free coffee for the next 5 years." He turned toward me with an amused smile. "Only 5. Do not negotiate while I am apologizing." We both laughed before the conversation quietly settled again. Liam took one slow breath. "There is something I never told you." My heart immediately sped up. "What is it?" He hesitated, then smiled at himself. "When you moved into the apartment across from mine 6 months ago, I noticed you on the first day." "Really? You spent almost 20 minutes trying to carry a bookshelf upstairs by yourself before finally admitting defeat." I covered my face with one hand. I was hoping nobody remembered that. "I helped you carry it." "You did." He nodded. "That was also the first day I realized I hoped I would keep running into you." I looked at him without saying a word. Liam laughed quietly, almost embarrassed. "The irony is incredible." "How so?" "I spent months trying to think of an excuse to ask my neighbor out for coffee." He smiled warmly. "Instead, my neighbor accidentally started investigating me." I could not stop laughing. "That is admittedly a terrible strategy. Probably not recommended." He looked directly into my eyes for the first time since the conversation began. "But even after everything, I still wanted to know you better." I felt my own smile grow without even trying. "That is good." Liam tilted his head slightly. "Why?" I stepped one pace closer before answering with complete honesty. "Because somewhere between misunderstanding you, apologizing to you, delivering groceries with you, and laughing at my own terrible assumptions, I realized I have been hoping for exactly the same thing." Saturday morning arrived with bright sunshine spilling across the sidewalks outside our apartment building, and for the first time in weeks I woke up smiling before my alarm even had the chance to interrupt me. A gentle knock sounded on my front door just after 9 o'clock. When I opened it, Liam stood there holding 2 paper coffee cups and a small paper bag from the neighborhood bakery. "Good morning," he said with an easy smile. "I thought today deserved cinnamon rolls." I laughed. "That is an excellent argument. I have several more if necessary." We carried breakfast to the small park a few blocks away where a weekend farmer's market had just begun filling the streets with colorful flowers, fresh fruit, handmade crafts, and local musicians playing cheerful acoustic songs beneath white tents. Families wandered from booth to booth while children sampled apple cider and chased bubbles floating through the morning air. Everything about the day felt wonderfully ordinary, and somehow that made it perfect. Liam looked around before quietly smiling. "You know something?" "What?" "A month ago, I thought my biggest problem was convincing my neighbor to have coffee with me." I laughed. "Instead, your neighbor secretly investigated you." He covered his face with one hand. "Please promise we never tell anyone that part." "Absolutely not. That story is staying with us forever." He shook his head, laughing so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. We spent the rest of the morning browsing little market stalls, arguing over which homemade cookies deserved first place, and pretending to be experts on vegetables neither of us had ever cooked before. At one booth, a local artist sold watercolor paintings of Seattle neighborhoods. Liam stopped in front of a small painting showing 2 apartment buildings facing each other across a quiet courtyard. "That looks familiar," I joked. He smiled softly. "It kind of changed my life." I glanced toward him. "Mine too." He quietly bought the painting before refusing to tell me why. "You will find out later," he insisted. That afternoon, we walked to the lakeside park where paddle boats drifted slowly across calm water beneath clear blue skies. We found an empty bench overlooking the lake and sat together watching ducks glide across the surface. The silence between us felt completely comfortable. There was no pressure to impress each other because we already knew the embarrassing stories, the bad jokes, the stubborn habits, and the awkward mistakes. Somehow knowing everything only made being together feel easier. After several peaceful minutes, Liam reached into the paper bag from the art booth and carefully handed me the small painting. "It belongs to both of us," he said. I looked at the picture again before noticing tiny handwritten words the artist had painted beneath the courtyard. "Home is often closer than you think." I smiled as warmth spread quietly through my chest. "That sounds familiar." Liam looked toward the lake before answering. "Maybe because it has been true all along." I gently rested my hand over his. "You know the strange part?" "What?" "The night I first saw you passing that cardboard box to someone, I thought I had discovered the worst thing about my neighbor." Liam laughed softly. "And now?" I looked at him with complete honesty. Now I realized that night was actually the luckiest moment of my life, because it forced me to stop making assumptions long enough to truly see the man standing across the hallway. Liam's smile grew warmer than the morning sunlight around us. "I am glad you finally did." We remained there watching the lake until the afternoon slowly faded into evening, and somewhere between quiet conversation, shared laughter, and one simple watercolor painting, I realized the greatest surprises in life rarely arrive through extraordinary moments. Sometimes they quietly appear disguised as ordinary days spent beside the right person. 1 year later, I sometimes found myself standing on the same apartment balcony with a cup of coffee in my hands, smiling at how completely wrong I had been on the night everything started. The parking lot looked exactly the same. The broken streetlight had finally been repaired. The maple trees still swayed gently whenever the Seattle breeze arrived, and neighbors still hurried home carrying grocery bags after work. Nothing about the building had really changed, yet my entire life had. Liam and I still lived across the hallway from each other. Although most evenings one of us inevitably ended up cooking dinner in the other's apartment before quietly forgetting whose place we had originally planned to stay in. We still laughed about the backwards assumptions I had made during those first few days. Every now and then Liam would walk past carrying a cardboard box just to watch me dramatically narrow my eyes before both of us burst into laughter. "Should I be worried?" I would ask with exaggerated seriousness. "Only if you dislike canned soup," he always answered with the same patient smile. Some jokes simply became traditions. Saturday mornings remained our favorite part of every week. We visited the neighborhood farmers market, drank coffee while walking through the park, and volunteered together at the Seattle Community Assistance Foundation whenever extra help was needed. The secret deliveries no longer belonged to Liam alone. They belonged to both of us now. One crisp autumn afternoon, we loaded groceries, medicine, and school supplies into Liam's car before driving to several homes around the city. Just as he had promised himself from the beginning, every delivery remained anonymous. No photographs, no public recognition, no expectation of thanks. Watching people quietly discover that someone cared enough to help without asking for anything in return became more rewarding than either of us could have imagined. As we returned to the apartment building that evening, Mrs. Henderson waved from her balcony before calling down with a smile. "You boys are home late again." Liam looked up and laughed. "We brought extra groceries this time." She nodded knowingly. "You always do." Later that night, the community center hosted its annual neighborhood appreciation gathering. Families filled the courtyard beneath warm string lights, while children laughed between picnic tables and local musicians played soft acoustic songs. Melissa walked over carrying 3 cups of hot chocolate before handing one to each of us. She looked from Liam to me with the kind of smile that suggested she had figured everything out long before either of us had. "So," she asked, "did you ever find out what your mysterious neighbor was really doing?" I laughed quietly before looking at Liam. "Yes." I smiled. He was quietly reminding everyone that kindness does not need an audience. Liam gently bumped my shoulder. "That sounds much nicer than your original theory." "My original theory was embarrassingly terrible." Melissa laughed. "Whatever it was, I am glad it worked out." After she walked away, Liam reached for my hand without saying a word. We stood together watching neighbors enjoy the evening, while warm lights reflected across the courtyard where our story had quietly begun. After a comfortable silence, Liam smiled and asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had never stepped onto that balcony that night?" I thought about the question for only a moment before gently shaking my head. "No," he raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" I looked at him with complete certainty. "Because I think life would have found another way to introduce me to the real you. I just wish I had trusted your heart before trusting my imagination." Liam smiled with the same quiet warmth that had first caught my attention months earlier. As we walked back toward our apartments beneath the evening lights, I finally understood that the greatest surprise I had ever discovered was never the secret my neighbor was protecting. It was realizing that the extraordinary person I had spent so much time searching for had quietly been living just across the hallway all along.